I had just returned to Chicago after 3 months on assignment, and I found my wife curled up on a cold park bench, snow covering her shoulders. Beside her was an old bag. Nothing more. I asked her what had happened. She didn't answer at first, only whispered that the door lock had been changed. When I called our son, his voice was cold. He said my wife was a freeloader, that she no longer had a place in that apartment. In that moment, I understood something painful. Some families don't fall apart because of poverty. They fall apart because of ingratitude. Before I go on, if you're listening to this story right now, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Your presence lets me know this story isn't being told in silence. And now, I'll tell you what happened right after that moment. I didn't ask another question when I saw Martha fall silent like that. 35 years of marriage was enough for me to know. When she stops speaking, it means she's endured far too much already. I draped my coat over her shoulders and guided her out of the park. The Chicago wind cut straight into our faces. The temperature had dropped so low that every breath felt heavy. I took her toward the building where our son was living, not to cause a scene, but to see with my own eyes what I still wasn't ready to believe. The elevator to the top floor moved smoothly, just like it always had. That penthouse, I had put down the deposit years ago, when Brandon had just gotten married. Back then I thought giving my son a good place to live was simply the right thing to do. I never put my name on it. I only co-signed. I didn't want control over their lives. I wanted them to stand on their own. But the door in front of me didn't open. The old access code no longer worked. I knocked. No answer. I called Brandon. It wasn't until the third call that he picked up. His voice showed no surprise when I told him I was standing outside. "It's not Mom's home anymore," Brandon said. "Dad, don't make this complicated." I asked him why. I didn't raise my voice. I just wanted to hear it. Brandon answered quickly, as if he had rehearsed it. He said his mother didn't contribute anything, only spent money. He mentioned doctor visits, pill bottles, the days her joints hurt, and disrupted his routine. He said the apartment needed quiet, needed image, needed order for his work. I stood there, facing the door. I listened without reacting. Maybe he thought I was considering his words. In truth, I was memorizing them. The door opened behind me. Tiffany stepped into the hallway. She didn't greet me. Her eyes passed over Martha, the way one looks at an old item left behind. In her hand was a plastic bag. She set it down on the floor, right next to Martha's feet. It was my wife's medication. "We're not a long-term care facility," Tiffany said. Her voice was flat. Not raised, not soft. Everyone has to take responsibility for their own life. Martha bent down to pick up the bag. Her hands were shaking. I saw it clearly. I looked at Tiffany, then I looked at Brandon standing behind her, leaning against the doorframe like this had nothing to do with him. I asked one last time, "Is this the decision of both of you?" Brandon nodded. No hesitation. I said nothing more. I didn't argue. I didn't use words I would later regret. I simply pulled the elevator door closed. As it shut, I saw Tiffany turn away first, as if the matter was finished. Brandon didn't look back. Inside the elevator, Martha leaned against the wall. She apologized to me. She said she didn't want to bother anyone. She said she had tried to take care of herself. She said maybe she should have left earlier. I told her she didn't need to say another word. I took her to a nearby hotel, not because it was luxurious, but because it was warm. I asked the front desk for a quiet room. I asked for hot tea. I asked for a light dinner. I sat beside the bed and watched Martha sleep. Her breathing was uneven, but steadier. Only then did I allow myself to think. 3 months in New York had given me enough distance to look back. I had spent my entire life in engineering, used to systems, structures, causes, and consequences. I don't believe in random actions. What Brandon did that day didn't happen overnight. I remembered the short phone calls, how often he rushed to end them. The times Tiffany spoke for him, I had brushed it off as work pressure. I chose silence because I didn't want to become a burden. That night I didn't sleep. I opened my laptop. I reviewed the old co-signing documents. I read every line of the lease agreements. I realized many changes had been made without my knowledge. My name was still there, but my role was no longer the same. I didn't feel anger in a loud way. I felt a familiar coldness. The kind you feel when a system you thought was stable begins to show a serious flaw. I knew what I needed to do, just not yet. The next morning I took Martha to see a doctor. I waited outside reading the news like any other day. No one knew what had happened. To the world I was just an older man taking his wife to an appointment in winter. But in my mind, everything had already begun to move. I didn't want revenge. I wanted order. I wanted things returned to their proper value. And I knew that to do that, I needed patience. Brandon believed I no longer held any authority. Tiffany believed I was old and tired. They didn't know that for many years I had grown used to standing behind the scenes, watching, and acting only when every piece of information was in place. That night when Martha asked if we should go back and talk to our son, I answered only one word: not yet. Some doors once closed cannot be reopened with words. They require consequences. I didn't tell Martha what I was doing, not because I was hiding anything, but because she needed peace first. After the appointment, I took her back to the hotel. The doctor said her joint condition hadn't worsened. She just needed to stay warm and take her medication regularly. Martha nodded, trying to look fine. I knew she was blaming herself more than she was feeling the pain. When she lay down for an afternoon nap, I went downstairs. I sat in a quiet corner of the lobby and reopened files I hadn't touched in years. Not because I had forgotten them, but because I had chosen not to remember. All my life, I kept family and finances separate. But now those two had been pulled together in a way I never wanted. My investments weren't in one place. They were scattered, quiet, working the way I always had. Old patents from my engineering days, small licensing streams that came in year after year. I had never explained any of it to Brandon. He only knew I lived comfortably. He probably thought it was just my pension. I started with the building. I called an old contact, someone I had worked with on a consulting project many years ago. His voice was the same, calm, direct, no unnecessary questions. I told him I wanted the ownership structure of the building where my son was renting. No reasons, just the data. By that evening, I had my answer. The building wasn't owned by a single person. It was managed by a real estate corporation with shares divided among investment funds. Not complicated, but layered enough that most people wouldn't notice. I read every report carefully. That's when I saw my name, not as an owner, but as a credit guarantor for a special flexible lease agreement. I understood then. Brandon hadn't just rented an apartment. He had used my reputation to reduce his own risk. He signed terms that placed the real responsibility on me if anything went wrong. He never asked. He assumed I would never find out. I didn't feel angry. I felt a very clear gap between what I had believed and what was now in front of me. The next morning, I told Martha we would stay at the hotel a few more days. I said I needed to take care of some old matters. She didn't ask questions. She just nodded. In her eyes, I saw something familiar. The quiet acceptance of someone who has spent a lifetime giving way. Every morning I left the hotel. Every late afternoon I returned. I didn't go to see Brandon. I didn't call Tiffany. I didn't want them alert. I needed them to keep living as if everything had already been settled. I worked through an investment fund. Not in my own name. Everything was legal, clean, transparent. I didn't buy the apartment. I bought decision power. I bought a voice within the management corporation. Piece by piece, quietly. No one noticed. No one questioned why a new fund was interested in an aging building during a Chicago winter. At the same time, I reread the guarantor agreements. I saw the clauses Brandon had taken advantage of. I saw the gaps I had left behind, because I trusted him. I didn't blame myself. I simply took note. One evening, Martha asked if we should return to our old house in the suburbs. I said, not yet. I said I wanted her to rest a little longer. She looked at me for a long moment, then asked softly, does our son know? I answered, he doesn't need to, not yet. That wasn't a lie. It was a necessary delay. I began paying attention to small signals. The photos Brandon posted online, the parties, the proud captions. The apartment lights were still on, every night. Their lives continued, completely untouched by the fact that an elderly woman had been left sitting in a snow-covered park. That only strengthened my resolve. A system reveals its true nature only when it isn't being watched. I let them be free. When the final procedures were nearly complete, I received confirmation. The fund I represented had become the controlling shareholder in the building's management company. No residents knew, nothing changed immediately. Everything appeared exactly the same. I sat in the hotel room looking out at the snow-covered street. I thought about the years behind me. I thought about how I taught Brandon responsibility, about standing behind one's words. I wondered when he had forgotten. Martha brought me tea. She said I looked tired. I told her I was fine. I held her hand. It was still cold. I knew that once things began to move, there would be no turning back. But I also knew that if I did nothing, this story would repeat itself somewhere else with someone even more vulnerable. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I only wanted to place everyone back into their proper position, within a system they had taken for granted. That night I received the building's event schedule, a private party at the penthouse, hosted by Brandon and Tiffany. The guest list was full of people they wanted to impress. The time, the location, everything was clearly laid out. I closed the laptop. Everything was ready. I didn't tell Martha about the party. She had finally started sleeping more deeply at night, and I didn't want to pull her back into heavy thoughts. I only told her I had something to take care of that evening. She nodded, reminded me to bring a scarf because the wind would be strong. Those small reminders were exactly why I needed to see this through, quietly, all the way to the end. The Chicago evening was cold and clear. I arrived at the building earlier than the party, not to be seen, but to observe. The main lobby was brightly lit. Staff moved with steady rhythm. No one knew who I was. That suited me just fine. I stood in a shadowed corner, watching the elevators rise and fall, listening to laughter drifting down from above. In my coat pocket was a new access card. The name on it wasn't mine. The title was Neutral Owner's Representative. I didn't need anything more. On the top floor, the music played at just the right volume. Luxurious, but not loud. Brandon was in his element. I could see him from a distance. Tailored suit, glass in hand, smiling at the right moments. Tiffany stood beside him, her eyes sweeping the room like she was inspecting the guest list. They were living inside what they believed was success. I remained behind a glass partition, unnoticed. I checked my watch. Right on time. The notification went out all at once. No loud announcement. Just soft vibrations, heads tilting down toward screens. Brandon reacted first. His smile froze halfway. I saw his shoulders stiffen. He read the message, then read it again. Tiffany leaned in to ask. Brandon handed her the phone. I watched her lips press together. The room stayed noisy, but between them, a space had opened. The message was short, dry. A notice of adjusted lease terms due to changes in management structure and a reassessment of credit risk. The new figure was clear. No long explanations. No room for argument, from $5,000 to $50,000 per month. I didn't need to see Brandon's expression to know what was happening in his mind. He turned away, walked quickly toward the balcony, and made a call. I caught fragments of rushed questions. Then silence. The call ended faster than he expected. He made another call. This one lasted longer. I saw his hand begin to shake. Tiffany stood beside him, trying to stay composed in front of guests, but her eyes had lost control. A few people started to notice. No one asked directly, but curiosity spreads fast in rooms like that. Brandon returned, forcing a smile. He told the guests there was a minor issue. No one fully believed him, but they were polite. Tiffany pulled him aside, her voice low and urgent. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw Brandon shake his head again and again. That's when I stepped forward. I didn't stand in the center of the room. I stayed near the entrance, where the light was bright enough to be seen, but not enough to draw attention. I waited until Brandon came closer. When he saw me, every movement in his body stopped. I need to speak with you, I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in that room, calm carried farther than music. Brandon pulled me aside. Tiffany followed, unable to hide her tension. He asked if I knew what was happening. He asked why that notice had been sent. He asked in the voice of someone losing control for the first time. I answered slowly. I said there had been changes in the management corporation. I said contracts were being reviewed. I said guarantor arrangements were no longer accepted the same way. Brandon looked at me, searching for an opening. He asked if I could help. He mentioned family. He mentioned everything I had done for him before. I didn't deny the past. I simply said the present was different. Tiffany stepped in. She talked about reputation, about the guests, about how this could be misunderstood. I listened, the way I had listened through countless technical meetings in my life. When she finished, I nodded. I understand, I said, but I'm not changing the number. Brandon asked who I was in all of this. He asked how I knew. I showed him the card. That was enough. I didn't need to say more. He understood. No one in the room knew exactly what was happening, but they felt the shift. A few guests began to excuse themselves. The music kept playing, but the rhythm was off. Tiffany tried to hold on to a few connections, but her confidence was gone. Brandon looked at me for a long time. This time he didn't speak. He just breathed heavily, like someone who had realized something could not be undone. "I didn't do this to embarrass you," I said. "I did it because certain lines were crossed." He started to say something, then stopped. Maybe for the first time in his life he didn't know how to argue back. I didn't stay long. I greeted the host politely. I took the elevator down, leaving behind a room where laughter was slowly fading. When the doors closed, I felt a strange sense of relief. Not victory, but the feeling that things were finally moving in the right direction. Outside, the snow was falling more lightly. I pulled my collar up and thought of Martha sleeping peacefully. I knew tonight wouldn't be the end of this story, but it was the moment the balance had tipped. And when a system loses its balance, what's been hidden never stays hidden for long. I didn't go back to the hotel right away that night. I walked a few laps around the neighborhood, letting the cold pull me back into a familiar state of clarity. I didn't want to carry the echo of that party back to Martha. Some things need to be said in order before they're spoken, even if only in silence. The next morning, Brandon called me. His voice was different. No urgency, no edge, just a fatigue he couldn't hide. He said he wanted to meet. Not at home, not at the office. He suggested a quiet cafe by the river. I arrived on time. Brandon arrived early. He stood when he saw me. An old reflex. I sat down. I didn't shake his hand. He apologized. Not long, not precise. He said things had gone too far. He said work pressure had made him lose control. Tiffany wasn't with him. I noticed that. I listened without interrupting. When he stopped, I asked one simple question. "Do you remember how that apartment was leased?" He looked away. I didn't wait for an answer. I took out my tablet and placed it on the table. On the screen were security recordings from our old house. I had installed the system years ago, for one reason only, so I could have peace of mind when I was away. Brandon froze when he saw it. In the video, he and Tiffany sat in the living room. No me, no Martha. They spoke casually. About money. About using my name as a guarantor. About buying time until I was no longer clear-minded enough to control my assets. They laughed. Not loudly, but clearly. I didn't let the video run long. I stopped it when Brandon turned away. I told him I wasn't showing this to shame him. I told him I needed him to understand why I couldn't pretend nothing had happened. Some decisions can't be undone with an apology. Brandon sat still. This time, no excuses. He asked me what I wanted. I said I wanted the truth placed where it belonged. I wanted every guarantee carrying my name withdrawn. I wanted contracts adjusted to reflect the risk they had created. He nodded, as if that outcome had always been inevitable. That afternoon, I called the fund's legal department. I asked them to proceed with the necessary steps. Everything moved by procedure. No emotion in the documents, only clauses and consequences. 2 days later, I received another call. This time, not from Brandon. It was from his company. They asked about my withdrawal as a personal guarantor for several financial obligations tied to Brandon. I confirmed. They thanked me and ended the call. That evening, Brandon called again. His voice was hoarse. He said the company had suspended him pending an ethics review. He said everything was collapsing quickly. He asked if I could intervene. I didn't answer right away. I asked him another question. "Do you remember how long your mother stood in that park?" On the other end of the line, there was no reply, just a long silence. I let the silence do its work. I didn't say who I had contacted. I didn't say where things were headed. I only said that when someone uses trust as a tool, they have to accept what happens when that tool is no longer there. Tiffany called me afterward. She didn't apologize. She talked about misunderstandings, about pressure, about how everyone makes mistakes. I listened to everything. I didn't argue. "I'm not punishing anyone," I said. "I'm simply no longer shielding you." The day Brandon moved out of the apartment was quiet. No arguments, no neighbors watching. I wasn't there. I didn't need to be. I received a report from building management that the unit had been returned according to policy. That evening, I came back to the hotel earlier than usual. Martha was sitting there, reading. She asked if everything was finished. I said no. But it was clearer now. She didn't ask anything else. She only said she hoped Brandon would be all right. I looked at her, thinking of everything she had endured without ever telling me. I didn't say things would get better. I just held her hand. I know some fractures can never be fully repaired, but once they're exposed, at least no one keeps walking on a floor that only pretends to be solid. And for me, that was necessary before this story could reach its end. Winter in Chicago lasted longer than I remembered. But once everything with the building was finished, I knew it was time to leave. Not to run away, but to close a chapter. Martha and I didn't return to the old apartment. We didn't look for another place in the city either. We packed slowly, leaving behind what we no longer needed. Each item set down felt like a weight lifted. Brandon didn't call me for weeks. I heard that he and Tiffany moved into a small apartment in the suburbs. No amenities, no bright lights, no one checking in. Brandon found temporary work. So did Tiffany. I didn't follow their lives closely. When information was necessary, it found its way to me. I completed the sale of my remaining stake in the building. The final amount was higher than I expected, but I felt no excitement. Money was only the outcome. What mattered was that things had been placed back where they belonged. I kept no control. I wanted to leave with light hands. Martha said she wanted someplace warmer. I agreed. We chose Napa Valley. Not for the wine, but for the quiet. A small vineyard. Not large. Enough space to walk each morning. Enough room for Martha to sit on the porch when her joints ached. I didn't need anything more. The first days in Napa moved slowly. I woke early, made coffee, watched the fog lift from the rows of vines. Martha smiled more. She began sleeping through the night without medication. I noticed. I didn't say anything. Some changes only need to be seen. One afternoon I received a letter from Brandon. Not an email. A handwritten letter. Thin paper. Uneven writing. He apologized, without blaming anyone. He wrote that for the first time, paying rent with his own work had made him understand the anxiety his mother once carried in silence. He didn't ask for money. He only asked to be allowed to say it. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it. I didn't respond right away. Not because I hesitated, but because I wanted to do what was right, not what was easy. A few days later, I sent Brandon an envelope. Inside wasn't a long letter, just a copy of a bill, 3 months of rent, with a short note. This portion was once carried by your mother, in silence. No blame, no promises. At the same time, I finalized the paperwork for a scholarship fund. It didn't carry my name. It didn't carry our family's name. It was for students whose families had cut off support midway, not because of grades, but because of circumstance. I used the money from contract penalties. I didn't touch the rest. I wanted everything clean. On the day I signed the final documents, Martha sat beside me. She didn't read every line. She only asked if I was sure. I nodded. She held my hand, tightly. We didn't talk much about Brandon after that, not because we forgot him, but because we had placed him where he belonged. A part of our lives, not the center of it. Spring arrived early in Napa. Martha planted a small patch of flowers in front of the house. I helped turn the soil even though my hands weren't strong anymore. Each afternoon we sat and watched the sunlight move slowly across the hills. No one asked about the past. No one calculated the distant future. Once Martha said she still hoped Brandon would be okay. I said I did too. But I didn't say things would return to how they were. Some things once broken don't need to be reassembled into their original shape. A few months later, I received a short email from Brandon. He wrote that he had found a more stable job. No mention of money, no mention of hardship. Just a thank you for not turning my back completely. I didn't reply, not out of coldness, but because I believe some distance is necessary for both sides to grow. One evening, sitting on the porch, Martha asked if I had any regrets. I thought for a moment. I said no. I said that if I hadn't done what I did, I would have carried that regret for the rest of my life. She nodded. A light breeze moved through the vines. No music, no noise, only the quiet we had paid dearly to earn. I don't see this story as a victory. I see it as a necessary correction. Family is not a place where everything is forgiven without limit. Family is a place where respect must exist, or it becomes nothing more than an empty name. When night fell, I turned off the porch light and closed the door. Martha was already asleep. I stood still for a moment, thinking about the road behind us. I no longer blamed Brandon. I no longer blamed myself. Some lessons arrive late, but they still need to be learned. And some people, only when forced to pay the price, finally understand the value of what they once dismissed. For me, that was enough to bring this story to a close. If you've listened this far, thank you for giving your time to this story. If it made you reflect, please like, subscribe, and share so others can listen as well. Your support helps stories like this continue to be told. Thank you for staying until the very end.